Hey everybody, this is PD from the Spin Rack, and today I'm doing a video on, oh man, I had it all put together beforehand, and now look at me, I'm not ready at all. I'm not ready at all. Everything laid out, and now I'm not ready. I need a good caricature, but I don't have it right on hand. So if you can see this, well, there's a caricature in the middle of John Byrne. I'm doing John Byrne versus Jim Shooter, right? Look, this should be a good one, right? Because they're sworn enemies type of deal, right? But most of this stuff is trying to burst some myths, and this one is no different. I guess to give you the overview, John Byrne has said that Shooter did good for Marvel, got everyone going on time, everyone was doing their best work, and then he ran out of things to do, but he was still fixing things. And he said the overall big change happened when Secret Wars happened. And with the success of Secret Wars, then he started saying how, look at this, to how to do this right, or how to do this idea that you want to do right. And at some point, Byrne didn't come into full conflict with Shooter. There were some conflicts which we'll go through, but the biggest conflict was when he decided to do Superman. So he already had run into some trouble on the Hulk. And then when Shooter found out that, we'll get to that in a second, he was doing Superman, then it was right at the point when he was brought back Jean Grey, where things were being changed and edited, and ultimately Byrne left, right? From Shooter's perspective, he looks at it, he's talked about how, he had to help John Byrne learn storytelling. He definitely talked about Byrne being one of the top talents at Marvel. And then he said that Byrne, what did he say? That Byrne didn't like being told no, and at the same time, he wouldn't let Byrne hack. That was the two things that came out of it. So those are the two perspectives. One showing some signs of the good the Shooter did during his time, and then one saying ultimately disagreed with him because he wanted to get away with murder, right? So ultimately, I want to say is that from what you can read in these, if you're actually reading these magazines, because a lot of these who's to add to the myth is that you read these magazines and if you read, I guess it's mostly from Byrne, right? But there's some Shooter interviews too from here also, is that Byrne has defended Shooter in the press, saying that that Shooter got kind of painted as the bad guy, and he said he fought for Byrne when he was a little guy, and he fought for Byrne when he was a big guy. When Gary Groff was trying to point out in this thing that the bad stuff about Shooter as an editor and as kind of a director of Marvel, and Byrne kind of stood up for him there too, right? So the thing that's kind of lost, this comics interview is at the right before everything goes left with Byrne on the FF, and this one is right at the same time when Byrne was doing the X-Men, and Shooter was heavily editing the X-Men, and he said that he said he like Shooter, he doesn't always agree with him as an editor, but at the same time, he liked working with Jim Shooter. So we'll get into that. But ultimately, out of all the people that's worked with Jim Shooter, many will say they're friends, but you can go through these magazines and you can see the one person who defended Shooter was Byrne, right? So ultimately you can hold that against them if you're an anti-shooter. But and Shooter's issues kind of come from this court case, where Shooter kind of said that Marvel Comics was the author of the comics. He said the writer. he said Chris Claremont, anyone that's there, they're not really the lead talents on it. The lead talents of the editors, the writers do, the bulk of the writing, but ultimately, if you got to see what the editors do, they kind of come up with the directions, keep the writers in line, that sort of thing. And ultimately, the author is Marvel Comics, so it's written by this person, Chris Claremont, but the author of X-Men is Marvel Comics. So that kind of put him in more hot water. There's other things that I think that was talked about that got him in hot water. Taking original art away from the writers. They used to get a page that had a lot of dialogue on it, and those were taken from the writer. They gave them all to the artist. That's what Shooter did. Anything else that got him on the fire? You think he changed the schedule? I think Byrne talked about he changed the schedule where everyone was on time, and then he kind of bumped it. So some people who had lead time had less of it, and some who was on time was now behind. So there was a couple of things. We'll get into that. But ultimately with Byrne, when Byrne was at Charlton, he got a couple stories. One story published by Marvel. The person who got him into Marvel was Chris Claremont, which I'm sure has said in an interview before. And Chris Claremont got him in because they needed someone on Iron Fist, and Byrne, but they needed quick. Byrne, they said they needed 10 days. And Byrne said, what I'm going to do with the rest of the week. And ultimately, he got the title. And he's still doing Charlton. And he said that at some point, Shooter talked with him and said, hey, if you work just with us, we'll give you as much work as you want. And being early in his career, there was a lot of corrections, a lot of redrawn stuff. Stuff other people did. There's covers that were redone, but ultimately, who was it? Marvel, to get where Shooter was at the same time Byrne was coming in there. Archie Goodwin was the editor-in-chief. I think right before that, Marvel was the editor-in-chief, and then Archie Goodwin was editor-in-chief. And Byrne, and Roy Thomas was in line to take back over Marvel. They had a couple hits in Conan, and they also had Star Wars that were a hit. So, and so Roy Thomas was the one who was kind of in line to take it back, and Stan wanted him back, but Roy said he didn't want the top salary as an editor, as the editor-in-chief. He wanted a writer salary. So if he's going to write, he'd get paid for the writing, and he'd have his editor-in-chief salary. And Marvel didn't really go for that. And then he left a little after that. But a lot of the artists started to leave Marvel. So, when Jim Shooter took over. So Jim Shooter takes over but Byrne had already got the X-Men because Archie Goodwin had kind of said that he wanted to go monthly. So he knew Byrne was a monthly guy and wanted the X-Men. So he said he wanted him and Terry Austin on this title, right? Because he liked their Star-Lord. So they put them on the title. Byrne talks with Archie. He says that both times he talked with Archie about wanting a different anchor, not because he didn't like Terry, because he felt that the fans it'd be jolting, it'd be kind of harsh to the fans to be that shift from Cockrum to Byrne. But Archie was just intent on saving it, so he wasn't really interested in keeping the look. He knew that the title needed legs, and he had a look he wanted, and he knew he could get it monthly, right? So Shooter said in an interview that Byrne was upset with him for getting Terry Austin. That wasn't really the case. Byrne said at some point, whenever he was doing a title, they would immediately, when he had like idea for like Silver Surfer, and they were going to get Terry to do it, but Byrne was like, well, no, I want kind of Tom Palmer to do it. So a lot of the jobs where he wanted a different inker on it, someone that in his career that he wanted to work with, like Tom Palmer or someone else, they would say Terry. But Byrne was the one who was kind of getting him to work with Terry again on. There's a bunch of stuff that Terry turned down also. Ultimately, Fantastic Four. He turned down Alpha Flight, the second year of Alpha Flight, and then later books like Spider-Man and New Gods, stuff like that. So anyway, Byrne gets the X-Men. At some point, the X-Men get hot, right? So X-Men gets hot, and it's not selling that is, the sales aren't that much. It's sustaining itself. But in the direct market, it's the hot book. It's the book people are talking about. It's getting these Eagle Awards. People are really a fan of the X-Men at this point. And then Shooter is coming into the room, and he's kind of being very critical as editor-in-chief of the X-Men, right? So they're taking it in. They're first trying to get a beat on what Shooter wants for Wolverine. So they're kind of playing a telephone game. And now Byrne and Claremont are kind of challenging each other with Wolverine, but Byrne is adding some stuff and Claremont's adding stuff. Then Shooter's kind of chiming in on the book also. So at some point, when they get to, Shooter comes in and he's like, this place needs to be a school. This is from Byrne's perspective. And then Byrne and Claremont were both like, no, they get shed the school like issue 8 or issue 6, something like that. They shedded it being a school years ago. And he said, no, they need to be the students of Charles Xavier. And Claremont and Byrne were like, Wolverine? He's like in his 40s at that point. I think he later turned 60, but it's like he looks like he's in his 40s. You got Nightcrawler's an adult, Storm's an adult. They can't actually be students. So you see this play out in issue 129, where Xavier is trying to treat them like the new X-Men, like students. And Cyclops is saying, no, they're individuals. I tried and failed. And but ultimately, they decided, hey, let's come up with a junior team, like some new mutants, right? And Shooter said, no, that sounds like the Legion of Substitute X-Men. So he rejected it. They had a whole storyline planned of some young mutants to join the team. So they kept Kitty Pryde to be one person who would join the X-Men. So they have a semblance of a student that was there. And at the same time, while they were doing this two-parter with Kitty, Shooter and a bunch of people came in the room and said, put Dazzler in here. And they're like, this is where the initial tensions that I talked about in here come from, where they kind of have this book where it's getting hot, and then the whole schedule of what they were going to do. They have this young team. They're going to have the original X-Men come back. They would be the teachers. It'd be the Phoenix Trauma, and the original X-Men would come back. At least Angel and Iceman would come back to the team. There's a calendar thing. I've already showed you guys that, where you show Iceman and Angel back in the X-Men with the new X-Men, right? So, but all that was nixed. So everything was shifted. Dazzler was added. So it's like a bunch of storylines that they had basically was reformatted. The stuff that was worked out with the editor now was reorganized with the Shooter, right? So then they're going through obviously the Dark Phoenix, and they've already established that Phoenix is going to become a bad guy, and Shooter's with it. That I think Shooter said that he was in this plotting session. I think Byrne got it from Claremont that Stephen Grant said, why don't you turn her into a villain, then you can do whatever you want. and that Byrne liked that. He didn't like it for Gene, but he said maybe someone could do that. Like who was it? Someone could do it like Mastermind. So it's like Mastermind can kind of push her there type of deal. So they kind of work with that. And then they obviously try to remove Phoenix from her, but the idea that Phoenix would be a reoccurring villain. That's what they were trying to get Phoenix to be a reoccurring villain, and something that happened to Jean that Jean wouldn't know. She would be regressed to a kid, as we've seen in X-Men Elsewhere. And Shooter decided that she was going off and being, it was a happily ever after story, which it wasn't. Wolverine is complaining, saying she's he said the make readies, but this was still at the pencil stage. So what happened? Um, Shooter saw the pages. He thought that she got off easy, wanted her to be punished, and you can see it play out in the Phoenix, the Untold Story. Um, he said she had to be punished. Came out on Byrne talk. Byrne said, he wasn't going to punish her, going to kill her first, and then they ultimately did that, and Shooter approved it. Now at the same time, Shooter said that he came up with they should do something, maybe imprison her, and then he said, well, we're going to kill her to kind of trick Shooter. And Shooter said yes, and then they said, are you crazy? All this other stuff, but it's none of that stuff plays out in Phoenix the Untold Story, right? But at the same time, Byrne and Claremont are hot. They're the hottest thing ever, right? They're the hottest thing ever, and and there's this tension. But Byrne wants to write a book, so he gets the Fantastic Four to write, and so he's going to utilize this star. But this is someone that Shooters kind of put directly onto the book, right? So this is going to be a thread that happens during Shooter's tenure, right? That you had some of the classic runs like Byrne on FF, Simonson on Thor, and possibly even the Hulk, Bill Mantlo on the Hulk. And is there another one? The X-Men, of course, where you see there's a split. He has these successes, but Shooter had a look or plan for these characters, even if they weren't successful before these guys got to it. Most namely Thor. Not really Daredevil, because but Shooter approved Frank Miller to be the penciler. Ultimately, Frank Miller wanted to write it, and then it wasn't Shooter who had to make the decision. It was Denny O'Neil, because he was faced with the same thing that happened on the X-Men. That the writer and the artist were at odds. They were a hot team, and the writer wanted to write the book. So the artist wanted to write the book. So who would he go with? And he was like, well, this book wasn't necessarily selling before Miller. So what if we side with the artist? Let's let the artist do it, and hopefully I could fix it if it's that bad. And the book takes off with Daredevil. So you had all these young guys, not Walter Simonson because he was already established. You had these young guys that Shooter was also kind of talking to them about storytelling, leading them away from some of the experimental stuff that was going on before them and going on at the time, and getting them to do classic storytelling, because that's all he would kind of allow, right? And when you tell this to people, a lot of people felt like Marvel was under the clamps of Shooter, and he wasn't really allowing them to do this, but it was a good, straightforward type of style like thing for Marvel to do. And but it led to a thread that would happen and how he was managing these artists, right? And this is only you can go to Shooter's blog, you can go to Byrne's website to get the actual talk from them. This is me distilling all the stuff from comics interview. You see all these books about these magazines that they're not actually books. Or you can go to Marvel, The Untold Story. There's a piece that he did with Secret Wars where he kind of points out that his difference of how he's writing the characters in comparison to his team, saying that he's doing a better job of it, and maybe they should kind of take that lead and put that in their books and it'd be more successful, like Secret Wars. So that's the kind of thread that I'm trying to go to right now, right? Because Byrne was on the FF and he couldn't that for some reason. Well, we know I already said in one of my older interviews that older discussions that Byrne had said no, Terry had said that he'd gotten 3 books at once, and he was like, "No, I'm not doing that." So he made a deal with the editor, and he did like covers of the Fantastic Four, and he did one 8-page story, right? So with that established, Byrne was like, and Byrne had also taken on this sort of not only being the hottest creator. Once he started writing, the fans didn't understand like how he's being allowed to do these things. So they thought there was kind of no editorial oversight for him. So they were like saying, looking at it and assuming that he was big enough to kind of push his stories through as as an artist. Being obviously he's an artist, not a writer. He's just pushing these stories through, and people not getting that a lot of his stories were more scientific, like also more like sci-fi type stories. Most people will say the Twilight Zone, but that's not understanding that the Twilight Zone was like a microcosm of what was in like the science fiction, actual science fiction novels, and EC Comics, because it had the harsh lighting and the film noir, which they were getting from Citizen Kane, and that's what they were kind of taking it and putting it into the Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone, even because it has like what Ray Bradbury has like a lot of classic sci-fi writers, but since it's all in one package, everyone thinks of the Twilight Zone as sci-fi when that's a small angle of sci-fi stuff, right? So they didn't really understand that. So at the same time, Byrne would kind of play to that because he'd be like, he's saying his editors were well-trained editors, and the person here, Jim Salicrup, is like, why would you say that? Like jokingly, why would you say that? And he said, hey, I think that's in here. And he's like saying that people that don't understand how the business goes, so he would do a joke about it. But at the same time, Shooter was more like the look. He'd slimmed down the Fantastic Four, and everyone else had drawn Reed, Sue, and Johnny bulky, and everyone lost like 20 pounds in Byrne stuff. And he had drawn the book before, but he was going back to the way they looked. And not because Byrne doesn't draw exactly like Kirby from the first 20 issues of the Fantastic Four, but he kind of captured issue 13. If you look at 13, it's kind of the Kirby inked by Ditko, that kind of feel, what he kind of got out of this sort of art. But excuse me. So he was, so Shooter was like, he had issue with this. He was like, but he didn't express it to Byrne. He expressed it to John Romita. Now, John Romita was the art director. He says the same thing Byrne says, that Shooter did a good job, but then ultimately, by the time Secret Wars came, he wanted everything shifted, right? So, what was it? Jim Shooter brings the book in his thing from Tomorrow's? In his book, he says he showed John Romita Byrne stuff, and he says, like, what do you think? And John Romita says, I think he should draw it the way Kirby does. And he's like, yeah, that's what we're thinking. And then John Romita's like, well, I'm not really here to tell people how to draw, though. It's just how I feel about it, but I'd rather not do it. So it's kind of, he wanted to kind of get John Romita, because Byrne, with the shift in the art, they thought most of the time they were like, well, if he draws it more like Neil Adams, and Byrne with a little more, so it's like, Neil Adams bodies with animation faces, and then Byrne. They felt it was like Byrne was going full animation when he started doing the Fantastic Four. So they were kind of like, but the sales had went up, so it was kind of like messing with something that was successful. This is my opinion on it, but the other stuff came from John Romita. John Romita said he wasn't going to say anything about it, and ultimately, from Byrne's angle, he was like, I just got a whole bunch of different editors, and it settled on the editor where we didn't quite always match, right? And I talked about that before too. So at the same time, so this is running into where Byrne was running into sort of conflicts. He wasn't really running into conflicts at that period. The only conflict after that he ran into with Shooter was doing Indiana Jones, because he didn't want to do Indiana Jones. And I think it's Roger Stern kind of talked him into it, saying it was more Indiana Jones fans than Marvel fans. So he was like, yes. And then Byrne wanted to do a cliffhanger every issue. But Shooter said no, the cliffhangers had to be within the issue. So that didn't appeal. And then, but he still wanted to do it. Then ultimately it fell apart for other reasons. So it's just having a tiny sort of thing, but it's ultimately they're friends and other stories that I can repeat that were on the Byrne board. You know, I think about how before Byrne was dating his wife, Shooter went out with her, and she said his wife talked about Burns, and then they started dating and whatnot. So they were friends. This is established that they were just friends, even though he was editor in chief and they were having issues, and they were taking in Shooter's storytelling, but at the same time, they started going their own way as far as art. Now, as far as artists goes, Shooter also was talking to artists like Sal Buscema and saying, I guess he couldn't talk to John Buscema about it, but went to Sal and said, hey, you're doing like, I don't know how many books in a line. You don't need to do that. You're doing too much, and we need you to concentrate. Because we kind of feel that you're just kind of, you know, like just just sending it in. And he's like, what are you talking about? He's like, I got X amount of things, and he was really bothered by it. But he's like, hey, you want me to, you know, concentrate on one book or a couple books? That's fine, you know, but then we just, you know, it could be better. So they're like talking over. You can see in the Hulk, he's doing full pencils, and so he got, who's that, Joe Sinnott doing inks on the Hulk, and that stuff is looking really good. So it's kind of like they get into that. Shows you that he's kind of looking at the artist and saying, hey, don't be, you know, like wanting the Kirby dynamic, but don't do the Kirby amount of books. Like really slow down. You turn into Byrne and saying, hey, what if you spent more time on one page instead of three? And then Byrne said, I would finish early in the day. So it was kind of like this idea that maybe the artist could do better if they were doing less didn't really factor into on how Byrne handled his workload. So that's just a difference on how to approach. But to show you, at the same time where he was giving storytelling critiques, now he's giving finishing critiques to other artists. But he couldn't really necessarily do that with people who he's teaching storytelling to, like Byrne or Miller, because at the same time, if it's about storytelling, and you say you don't like the look of this drawing, it's like, well, does this tell the story? And this is just opinion again, because I don't have anything on there. We're just saying what kind of differences it could be. So we'll keep precursor in it, what is from these articles and what is opinion, because it's kind of tough to do and think, because I don't have the two people in the room, which they would probably, you know, be able to be more succinct, but I'm just trying to distill it all into one thing, right? So at some point while he's doing the Fantastic Four, Chris Claremont hits him in this issue where Lilandra says, I think it's 268, where Xavier almost becomes a brood, and they save him, and then they find out, which is months later, that Reed Richards saved Galactus, and Lilandra is mad, and she goes and she points her finger at Reed, saying, if Galactus eats another world, you will pay for it. You will pay for that crime, right? And ultimately, it was an odd piece for me to see in there that she went and visited the FF type deal, similar to Ronin. So Byrne saw it and he was like, "What?" He didn't say that, but he was surprised because Shooter was the one who approved Galactus being saved by not just Reed, but by the Fantastic Four and the Avengers. It was more so Reed, Captain America, and Thor, but Iron Man, Human Torch, and the Thing, who were kind of not with it. They and I guess Wasp also. They decided it had to be done anyway. They agreed with them, even though they feel like he might as well let him go. He's more trouble than he's worth. So they save him. Shooter approved it. He approved it all the way through, and now they got a slight in the book. Right now, Shooter never talks about it initially being a slight by Chris Claremont. Right. So Byrne comes into the room and says, "Hey, what is this? And what are you going to do about it?" And he told Byrne to do a story on it, right? So Byrne did the story, which is 257 to 262, where Nova says, "Hey, the Skrull homeworld. Galactus is hungry, so he eats the Skrull homeworld, and 2 seconds later, Reed is removed. Removed, same way the X-Men was, and it kind of explains to you what happened to the X-Men, seeing from another angle. Reed is taken. Nobody knows what happened to him. They have a big fight with Doom and Terrax. They try to get Reed. It doesn't come. And then at that point, Sue realizes she has to figure out and find out where Reed is. And they find him. They have the trial and it's one of the most memorable arcs in the run, right? That is a reaction to what Chris Claremont did. And most people remember that Byrne did the story where he made the Doom that was in the X-Men, Doombot, and a lot of people saying how could he done that, but it was kind of a pushback. It was a reaction to what Chris Claremont did, right? But most of the time, Shooter will say now that Byrne was taking shots at him in the book, but ultimately the shot initially came from one angle. Like Byrne was like, he's not doing any X-Men stuff, but then there was some pushbacks, right? So then the title moves is shuttling forward, and what was it? I think Byrne struggled with the Silver Surfer issue, a lot of stuff being redrawn by Tom Palmer, which I think was at Shooter's request, and then the Hulk happened. So, oh no, that's the other thing that happened was at the same time. Shooter wanted Byrne to do some more X-Men stuff, and Byrne said never, and said never to the X-Men, no more X-Men, right? So he's trying to get him to do Alpha, but Byrne was kind of iffy on Alpha, and ultimately he decided to finally do Alpha. But the thing is, the original plan was to do 12 issues. He wound up doing 28. And so at the same time, Shooter was also trying to get him to do other X stuff. And Byrne said he asked him to do the X-Men Teen Titans. I don't know if he asked him to do X-Men Micronauts, but then Byrne agreed to do X-Men Alpha Flight. But he said, have Kitty go on vacation because he didn't want to draw Shadowcat. And he was like, and have someone else do the plot. Because that would make it work for me and have him just script it. That'd be the easiest thing for me. And then he got the plot, and Kitty was all over it. So he was like, nope. And most people say, well, Byrne left and they got Paul Smith. It's like, well, they called Paul Smith and he said, hell no. And then he saw a motorcycle. This is in Wizard. He said, I saw a motorcycle they wanted. And he said, hey, let me call back Marvel. And that's how he got on X-Men Alpha Flight. So there was a bunch of things where Shooter was asking Byrne to do work with Claremont on some X-Men stuff. It was mainly doing X-Men stuff with Chris Claremont. And then ultimately they were in a car ride because they were doing cons. They were pretty close. And these interviews happened. He defends Shooter. And then I think in the ride in the taxi, he explains what he wants to do with the Hulk. obviously getting him back to where he was, kind of a creature of the night, right? And getting back to where he was in Avengers, the first Avengers issue, right? And he said, Shooter said, great, you gotta figure a way to do it, right? To get on the book. And he's like, what am I gonna do? Call Madlow? Madlow's like, nope, don't wanna leave. He said, what can I do? And he says, hey, you wanna do the Alpha Flight? We do a swap. They call Mike Mignola. Mike says, hey, why not? And they say yes, they do the swap. So Byrne is like, I got the title. There's a big buzz around Byrne doing the Hulk. And then as the issues coming out, all the stuff he told Shooter he wanted to do, Shooter was like, you can't do that, right? So now at the same time, the same hot numbers outside of the Thing. I don't think the Thing was initially a big seller, but it probably was either more or the same of what it was with 2-in-1. But Alpha Flight was a big seller. Fantastic Four got bumped up. The initial buzz around Indiana Jones was a high number, and the Hulk that jumped in numbers too, because it had the Crossroads period. Then there's this big jump when Byrne got on it, but no one really talks about it. You got to look at the sales and the statement of ownerships. But so they got to the issue, which is 320, which is a Marvel fanfare issue. Now Shooter talks about this, and he says that Danny O'Neill rejected it because he was already in hot water with Shooter, and then Byrne went up to Marvel, to the editor, the publisher, Mike Hobson, and Hobson's, he went to Jim Gatlin, and Jim Gatlin said, who is John Byrne? And that was basically saying, trying to make it sound like he got egg on his face. But Byrne had a different angle on it. His thing was that, as I said, he told Shooter what he wanted to do. Shooter was, at some point later while he was doing it, was bothered with it. And then Danny O'Neill, who was on the hot water, when Byrne brought in this book that wasn't, he didn't say that he was going to do all splash pages. He told the story, but he didn't say that. So Danny O'Neill took the issues and put it on the shelf, right? And Byrne was like, it can't really work this way with everybody on eggshells. So he left the book, and Al Milgrom took over the book after Byrne. You see a dip in sales, and then but Byrne was planned to stay on the Fantastic Four. He had big plans for a whole year worth of storylines, and but at the same time, Byrne had let his contract wane. So Dick Giordano and Marv Wolfman. Okay, so got to bring Marv Wolfman into this because it's going to be brought up later. Marv Wolfman was like, "Hey, everyone's pitching Superman. They have I think it was Carrie Bate. No, it was what's the Superman right now? But Marv Wolfman, they pitched Superman reboot. Frank Miller and Steve Gerber pitched a reboot. A couple others, some that I don't know, and it kind of stalled. And this thing was ending, so Marv Wolfman had found out that they knew that Byrne's contract, his exclusive contract was gone. So he told Dick Giordano, expecting he'd get kind of the Superman he wanted too. So he called Byrne up and said, "Put your money where your mouth is." So Byrne went into talks with DC. Not the first time. He talked with them about before Crisis happened, which was history of the DC universe, and Byrne declined. So this time he gave his list of demands, and they rejected one. They actually rejected two, but he didn't know that had needed to be a demand. So he was okay with it and moved on. Then he said, "I need to go to the publisher." He's like, it'd be easier talking to the publisher about this. So he went to the publisher, Mike Hobson, and Mike Hobson said, "Hey, what's good for Superman is good for the industry," right? So then Shooter found out, and Shooter, at that point, Byrne found out that stuff that was approved was now getting art corrections, and ultimately there's one book, which is Fantastic Four 286, which is the return of Jean Grey, which was approved by Shooter, now was under editorial that Byrne was told to redraw this issue. Now, I think someone in production said that Byrne was almost fired for this. But if you look in the comic press, they talked to Byrne when he left the Fantastic Four. And Frank Miller also said he left Marvel at the same time, saying that, well, he said, Frank Miller said he wasn't taking any new books after Electro Assassin. But Byrne said, he asked me to redraw it, but I asked him what was wrong with the issue. And ultimately, I don't have time. So he basically told Shooter, I don't have time to redraw it. And he didn't redraw it, right? So they got Jackson guys to do it. And then there's some art corrections, some cover rejected, stuff like that. So then Burns said he decided to leave the FF. So you have this thing where they went to being kind of close, and then, at some point, even though the sales and all that stuff is still working for Byrne, he's falling under scrutiny with Shooter. And there's not just him. There's a whole issue of Secret Wars 2 that Sal Buscema did that was totally shelved. The Sal Buscema cover of that was shelved, which was redrawn. Byrne said, I just used the same layout. I don't know why he rejected it. So I just did use his same exact layout and it was approved. So, but everyone at the same time, that's why I bring up this thing with Shooter on the cover. This time is the Kirby artwork that's falling from, where he's getting issued that he's keeping the artwork from Kirby. He's taking the heat for that, even though it's not all him, but he says that Kirby was suing, but ultimately Kirby, I think Mark Evans said someone said that Kirby was going to sue, and they took it as him suing, and it just turned into a steamroll thing where Shooter kept saying that they were suing, and they said there was a big conflict at the con where Jack Kirby said he wasn't suing. So whichever way you want to go with it. But ultimately, the point of it is, this video is that at some point they were friends. They collaborated on only a couple things. They're supposed to do, I think, Ghost Rider together. But, ultimately, as I guess post-Secret Wars, tension got high, and Byrne, who went from being his biggest defender, that's where the cog in the machine of Marvel, kind of came from, and talking about that and working with his editors and talking these things over before doing them. But it kind of fell, it changed. The same with Frank Miller says basically the same thing, that he was close, we were friends. He taught me a lot of stuff about storytelling. And then at some point we disagreed about everything, even the shape of the planet. So that's happened. Byrne leaves, goes to Superman. He doesn't say much in the press about what happened. He does say that he did tell Steve Englehart his plan for the Fantastic Four, which was the Doom War between Christoph and Dr. Doom, and kind of utilized some of that. Hinted there was, I think Roger Stern did the wedding. Byrne didn't say what his plan for the wedding for Johnny and Alicia, if they were going to get married or not. I tend to believe that they weren't, but who knows, right? So there's nothing going on between Byrne and Shooter, and no real thing in the press, except I guess when Shooter gets fired, Byrne in Legends does the spoof on the Star brand. And then people look at it like, well, when he came back to Marvel, he immediately went to Star brand to do something. I think that was it was something in between him and Howard Mackey, where Howard Mackey and him had a joke about whatever title was available. Byrne would say, he would call up and say, hey, do you want to do such and such a title, and Byrne was like, I can't, 'cause I'm too booked. So when Howard Becky called him from something else, Byrne was like, I can't do Star Brand. He's like, I wasn't calling for that. And then he didn't feel like he was kind of tricked. At the end of the phone call, he was doing Star Brand. Now, he also talked with Mark Grunwald about Star Brand because he was also thinking about how to revitalize the whole Marvel. We'll say, how do we revitalize this whole line? So it was a Roy Thomas called Shooters and what's the name? Called Shooter's New Universe. If Marvel is like the Hollywood movies, then the new universe is TV movies, right? So they're saying, how do we make this a big splash? So they decided we blow up something. They had to figure out who was going to do it. They decided that Ken Connell would be the one. So they're working this all out. And Byrne, if you look at mainly his first issue, he kind of, when he worked on Star Brand, I realized that Ken Connell was a smart guy, but he kind of was doing a lot of stupid things. Byrne kind of played up in that first issue that he was pretty intelligent, right? I think Debbie was kind of south when Shooter was doing them because she became more of a damsel in the hospital and not just distressed. She was he was put into the hospital and she went a little crazy during Shooter's run. But Byrne had her the stable one in the title. So issues for the first 3 issues, she's kind of the heart of it. But of course, I think Shooter's girlfriend basically thinking they were based on Shooter's real life. She threatened to sue, and they had to remove that character. So Ken Connell does something pretty terrible, and most fans who didn't know the inside stuff later find out that, oh, this was basically based on Shooter. Byrne's blowing up Pittsburgh. Oh, wow. What a dig. But they were kind of following the thread that Shooter had. If you kind of read the stories, Ken Connell is kind of the smart, dumb guy. So it's kind of plays out the right way. That's the best thing to say about Byrne's run on Star Brand. And Star Brand needed a shot in the arm. So Byrne was just that. Ultimately, it was just a little too little, too late to fix the title. But at the same time, if you actually read Star Brand, you would be like, and you read the ones that Byrne did, you'd be like, wow, finally something happened in this title. I mean, the first issue something happens, but at the same time, it's not really. Ultimately, for me, I got more interested in the girlfriends in Shooter's run, and in Byrne run, it was more, because there was multiple people utilizing the Star Brand. It was always most interesting when Byrne was handling Ken Connell. So the other people were better heroes, but Ken Connell was the kind of the person who I came in for. Byrne was doing a good job of capturing that voice, and in capturing that, he could make some big flaws. So with that said, they really, outside of Byrne, people asking him about what happened and him telling them that angle of it, and I think he did a little gag in what's that thing? Byrne did a gag on Shooter, and we had the Shooter thing was someone you just see the legs, regular sized people, and you just see legs, and that was a Shooter thing. So he had someone with a cup, and you just see legs and a hand with a cup, type of deal, right? So I don't know how many other times they met at the cons, but at the Marv Wolfman trial, where basically Byrne was kind of enlisted by a friend of Marv's who didn't want to testify, so he kind of talked to Byrne, since I guess Byrne knew the situation similar. Basically, he didn't want to have to. This friend didn't want to say anything at this trial, right? So he said, "If Marvel calls you, would you talk?" And he said, "Yeah, I would. I'll tell the truth." And Byrne somehow became star witness. The Shooter was also at this trial, right? So at some point in the trial, Byrne and Shooter together and they talk. And Byrne said it's similar to what Shooter was like before the madness, and that sort of thing. So ultimately, they were in the room together, and Jim Shooter, Byrne said, Jim Shooter said, I don't have the phrasing right. I know I don't have it all, but it was basically saying he couldn't believe that Mark Wolfman said that Byrne didn't create characters, in his life. That he's like, and that's, if you know that trial, that's ultimately where it's kind of sad to hear Marv kind of. I mean, his perjury isn't a big deal in trials, but if you care about perjury, you're basically saying Byrne doesn't create characters, when creating characters isn't just creating cool characters that turn into Wolverine, Punisher, Deadpool. Creating characters are the supporting characters, the villains, the family, like that sort of thing. That's creating characters, the world that the person lives in. And Byrne, definitely in his time at Marvel, there's a bunch of characters he created. And maybe he doesn't have, outside of Sabretooth and Kitty Pryde, he doesn't have a solo sort of character that is as big as Thanos or something like that. But, he has created characters, which is something to kind of discredit Byrne, that they're on different wavelengths. But with that said, that's the point of the video. At some point they were friends, it went south, right? But ultimately, what never gets said in any of these interviews, that Byrne is just taking swipes at Shooter, that when people are taking swipes at Shooter, Byrne is defending them. Byrne is saying this is before everything went left. Said he, and I said this before, he fought for me when I was a little guy. He fights for me now when I was a big guy. So it's kind of sad that, when Shooter talks about, why is Byrne off? Why did Byrne leave Captain America or Byrne and Stern? He said, well, one of them didn't like me, probably John, but ultimately Stern was the one who decided to leave, and Byrne left afterwards. Both have said, no, not what's the name, said that Shooter was going to put in a fill-in, and that was going to hurt their bonus that they were going to get for completed issues. Byrne has said that what happens, that Shooter didn't want any 3-part stories. Jim Sellecook, who's the editor of Captain America, agreed. And then, who is it? Frank Miller said that same thing too. So the thing that she was saying, that Byrne didn't like him, that's why he left. And then Roger left with Byrne. There's more. Stern left. Stern has always said that he's left. Byrne's only said that Stern left because he had three-parter that Shooter said he couldn't do, because he no more 3-parters. And Byrne left in solidarity with Stern. But that's ultimately why I was kind of doing this, because a lot of things or interviews by Shooter, which kind of gets lost in turning into allowing people to go into, hey, Byrne is the big bad guy now. If I say something negative about him, people are going to eat it up. But let's find an interview where we have some other creator defending him. That's what you have to remember when you look at these things. But at some point, they had one person who was cheering for him, and and now that they're on opposite sides, only thing that gets brought up that, Byrne didn't like me. Byrne didn't like, at some point, yeah, probably later he didn't. But while they're at Marvel, they were close. Right? That's the point. I think I said it, reiterated a bunch of times, and saying it's going left some point later. Right? So, yeah, but check out some of these books, right? Read for yourself. This is, Rob Liefeld tells about the book where he got heat. It's not in this one. This is just a couple gags. This is the one. But in here he defends Shooter. And in here, what else? I think that's it. Spinnerack is out.